Back in 1996, one man stood up and tried to declare a whole new world independent from the old one. It was this incredibly bold, revolutionary act that really, it defined an entire era of digital optimism. So, what was this declaration all about? Let's get into it.
This right here. This was the opening shot. With these words, John Perry Barlow, a guy who went from writing lyrics for the Grateful Dead to being a tech philosopher, he basically drew a line in the sand. On one side, you had the old world of government and industry, and on the other, a new, borderless digital frontier.
You know, for anyone who remembers that awful screech of a dial-up modem, this was the sound of plugging into that new world. And Barlow's declaration? It was its anthem. But you have to wonder, behind all the powerful words, what was this revolution really about? And could it ever actually succeed?
Okay, so to understand the impact this thing had, we first have to get our heads around the sheer scale of the dream Barlow was selling. It was, nothing less than a new utopia.
And this wasn't just some fringe figure shouting into the void. Barlow was hugely influential, a really high-profile member of the early digerati, the digital elite. The press even started calling him the Thomas Jefferson of cyberspace, which just shows you they were framing his declaration as this foundational document for a whole new kind of nation.
And the vision he laid out in his declaration, well, it was radical. He imagined a world built on a completely new social contract, a civilization of pure thought, where there was no need for traditional government, because, he argued, it would be inherently more humane and fair than anything that flesh and steel could ever build.
It was such a powerful idea, and the way Barlow built this myth was just as important as the myth itself. He did it through a masterful use of language. You see, his declaration wasn't just a description of something that existed. It was what academics call a performative document. He was using words not just to explain cyberspace, but to actually try and will a specific version of it into existence, to make it real, just by declaring it was. So how did he do it? What was in his bag of tricks? Well, he built his case using a very specific set of tools. He constantly brought up the spirit of the American Revolution, created these really clear good versus evil battles, and used sweeping emotional language that was honestly more about feeling than about deep critical thought.
Just look at this. He painted a world of these stark, simple contrasts. On one side, you have the old, heavy, industrial past. On the other, the new, enlightened, digital future. It's a classic epic battle, and he made it crystal clear which side you were supposed to be on.
It was a compelling story for sure, but if you start to look a little closer, that utopian vision, it starts to show some pretty serious cracks. Turns out, the foundation wasn't quite as new as it seemed.
For starters, there's this massive contradiction right at its core. He wrapped himself in the flag of the American Declaration of Independence, right? But the whole point of that document was to establish the right to create a new government. Barlow's goal was the exact opposite, to reject the very idea of government itself.
And as the critic Aimée Morrison points out, Barlow's vision of cyberspace wasn't just about pure, lofty thought. He defined it as consisting of transactions, relationships, and thought itself. And that first word, transactions, man, that is key. This wasn't just a political philosophy, it was a free market one. It was an early glimpse into the kind of libertarian ethos that would end up defining so much of Silicon Valley. And the idea that cyberspace was this brand new world, totally separate from the old one, well, that was just not true. The internet was built over decades, first by the military, then by academics, all funded and supported by the very same giants of flesh and steel that Barlow was now telling to leave us alone.
For a while, though, none of this really mattered. The dream was just more powerful than the facts. But as the internet grew up, the dream started to feel like a relic from a more naive time.
Get this. At its absolute peak, Barlow's declaration was referenced on over 20,000 websites. 20,000. It was everywhere. A viral cornerstone of early web culture. It really felt like the truth.
But by 2003, the tide had completely turned. The Economist, looking back, just dismissed it as just another example of 1990s hype. The dot-com crash had brought a very heavy dose of reality with it.
A year later, The Guardian called it hopelessly naive. That beautiful utopia of bodiless minds now seemed to them more like a utopia for liars and thieves. The initial optimism was fading, and it was fading fast.
What's really interesting is that even Barlow himself started to have his doubts. He later described his whole strategy from that era as lifestyle libertarianism, this belief that if you could just change how people thought, the messy business of politics would kind of sort itself out. It's an idea that echoed all through early tech culture, the belief that code could solve human problems, making politics obsolete. He came to realize it wasn't that simple.
But this wasn't the end of the story. The ideals behind the Declaration, that fight for freedom and openness online, they didn't just disappear. They just found a new and much more practical way forward.
So yeah, the dream of a free internet, it didn't die with 90s idealism. It just evolved from a poetic declaration into a real-world political fight. The whole model shifted. Instead of just striking a revolutionary pose and making grand statements, the movement for digital rights actually got to work. It traded that sweeping rhetoric for the hard grind of lobbying, legal challenges, and building coalitions. And this is best seen in the work of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, or EFF, which, by the way, Barlow himself co-founded. They're the ones fighting these battles in the trenches, in courtrooms and in legislative hearings, over really concrete issues like file sharing, copyright, surveillance, and government secrecy. This is the evolution from talk to action. And this really gets to the heart of the lesson learned here. As the scholar Sally Wyatt wrote, when you present technology as some kind of magic bullet for freedom, you actually take people out of the equation. You remove them from the actual, difficult, historical process of making real political change.
Which, of course, leaves us with a question for today. Barlow's utopian declaration. It might seem like a historical artifact now, but the conflicts he was talking about between freedom and control, the individual and the institution, openness and regulation, they are more relevant than they have ever been. So, was the dream just a naive fantasy, or is it a battle that's still being fought in the trenches every single day?